What happened to the Nazis after the war? How thousands escaped justice. Most of them got away. That is the sentence history books bury in footnotes. That is the truth no monument was ever built to acknowledge. Out of the tens of thousands of men and women who administered the Holocaust, who signed the orders, ran the camps, loaded the trains, and pulled the triggers, the overwhelming majority lived out their natural lives in peace. They grew old. They had grandchildren. They died in their beds. How is that possible? How does a man who supervised the murder of 14,000 people in a single afternoon end up running a pharmaceutical company in West Germany 20 years later? And how does the architect of the entire deportation system, the man who personally coordinated the logistics of genocide for an entire continent, escape to Argentina and spend a decade and a half raising his family in a quiet suburb of Buenos Aires? How do the institutions that claimed to represent justice, morality, and the rule of law, churches, governments, intelligence agencies, not only fail to stop this exodus, but in many cases, actively enable it? The answer will change the way you understand the post-war world, because what happened after 1945 was not a clean reckoning. It was not justice. It was a negotiation. And the people paying the price of that negotiation were the dead, who could not speak for themselves, and the survivors, who were told to move on. This is the story of the rat lines. And this is the story of how the Third Reich did not end. It relocated. Before we go further, if you are new here, this is the unseen past. We cover the stories history forgot, buried, or was too afraid to tell. Subscribe now and drop a comment telling us which hidden history you want us to expose next. To understand how they escaped, you first have to understand what Europe looked like in the spring and summer of 1945. Picture a continent that has been physically destroyed. Not inconvenienced, destroyed. Roughly 70 million people are dead. The road infrastructure across Poland, Ukraine, Germany, and France is rubble and craters. Entire cities, Warsaw, Dresden, Cologne, Stalingrad, have been reduced to architectural skeletons. Bridges are gone. Records are burned. The bureaucratic infrastructure of a dozen nations has either collapsed entirely or exists in scattered, chaotic fragments held together by exhausted civil servants who themselves have no idea who is alive, who is dead, and who is missing. And into this chaos, 50 million displaced people are moving. 50 million. They are moving in every direction simultaneously. Survivors of concentration camps, liberated POWs, civilians fleeing advancing armies, ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe, workers brought to the Reich by force and now trying to find their way home. This is the largest human migration in recorded European history, and it is happening in real time, across a landscape where there is almost no functioning authority to track any of it. The Allied powers have created something called the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA, to manage this crisis. But UNRRA is overwhelmed within weeks. The displaced persons camps it runs are processing more people than any system could track. In many of these camps, there are no reliable methods of identity verification. A man can claim almost any name, any nationality, any history. If his papers are gone, and millions of people's papers are gone, he is largely taken at his word. In Germany and Austria, the Americans, British, French, and Soviets divide the country into 4 occupation zones. The borders between these zones are not perfectly sealed. Movement between them, especially in the chaotic early months of 1945 and 1946, is entirely possible for anyone with determination, money, or the right connections. This is the world into which the perpetrators of the Holocaust vanished, not into thin air, into a specific, historically documented infrastructure. a network of escape routes and safe houses and false papers and institutional complicity that historians would eventually name the rat lines. And by the time the Nuremberg trials opened in November 1945, thousands of men who belonged in the dock were already gone. The rat lines did not appear from nowhere. They were built deliberately by multiple overlapping organizations with different motivations who found themselves pursuing the same goal. To understand how the network functioned, you have to start at the beginning, and the beginning is in Rome. Bishop Alois Hudal was an Austrian Catholic prelate stationed in Rome who had been a vocal sympathizer of National Socialism through the 1930s. He was not a fringe figure. He had published a book in 1937 arguing for a reconciliation between the Catholic Church and Nazism. By the time Germany collapsed in 1945, Hudal was operating out of the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico di Santa Maria dell'Anima, the German National Church in Rome, and he had decided, with startling moral self-confidence, that his mission was to save German and Austrian war criminals from Allied justice. Hudal later wrote in his memoirs, with breathtaking candor, that he considered himself a spiritual father who wanted to help men escape what he called, and this is exact, the victor's law. He did not hide his rationale. He believed that former Nazis deserved protection. He organized false identity documents. He arranged lodging in Catholic institutions across Rome and northern Italy. He connected fugitives with contacts in South America who could arrange immigration papers. And he did all of this with the passive knowledge, and in some cases the active assistance, of figures within the Vatican's own bureaucratic structure. The Vatican has never fully acknowledged its institutional role. It has admitted that some individuals acted wrongly. But the infrastructure Hudal used, the seminaries, the monasteries, the official church channels for issuing letters of reference, was not a private operation run by one eccentric bishop. It was woven into existing legitimate institutions. And it worked. From Rome, the rat line extended in two main directions. The one route went south to the port of Genoa, where ships departed for South America, primarily Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, and Paraguay. The other route went east through Austria, and then down into Italy, often passing through the Brenner Pass, the Alpine crossing that had served as a corridor between Germanic Europe and the Mediterranean for centuries. Cells of former SS officers, what survivors and prosecutors would later call Odessa, an acronym standing for Organisation der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen, or Organization of Former SS Members, operated safe houses along these routes. They provided money, forged documents, civilian clothing, and guidance. Whether Odessa existed as a single centralized organization or as a looser network of overlapping cells remains a subject of genuine historical debate. So what is not debated is the outcome. The escape routes functioned. Thousands of men used them. And the evidence points to coordination that was too consistent and too effective to be purely spontaneous. The critical document technology was the Red Cross travel document. The International Committee of the Red Cross, based in Geneva, issued travel documents to stateless persons and displaced individuals who could not obtain regular passports. The intention was humanitarian, to help genuine refugees. But the system had a catastrophic vulnerability. The ICRC issued these documents based largely on declarations of identity made by the applicants themselves. If a man claimed to be a Croatian refugee named Helmut Müller, rather than an SS colonel named someone else entirely, and if a church official or camp administrator countersigned his application, the ICRC would issue the document. Between 1945 and 1951, the ICRC issued roughly 120,000 such travel documents across Europe. Historians cannot say with certainty how many of them went to war criminals, but they can say this: Nearly every major Nazi fugitive whose escape route has been reconstructed in detail passed through this system. The Red Cross travel document was the master key. Now, we must follow specific men. Because the scale of this story only becomes real when you look at individual cases. And no individual case is more instructive or more infuriating than that of Klaus Barbie. Barbie was born in 1913 in Bad Godesberg, a quiet German town on the Rhine. He joined the Hitler Youth as a teenager, the SS at 22, and the Gestapo, the secret state police, shortly after. By 1942, at the age of 29, he had been posted to Lyon, France, as the head of the Gestapo's local section. Lyon was the center of the French resistance, and Barbie's assignment was to break it. What he did in Lyon over the next 2 years earned him a name that survived him: the Butcher of Lyon. He personally tortured prisoners in the basement of the Gestapo's headquarters at 84 Avenue Berthelot. Survivors described in courtroom testimony, decades later, because it took that long to bring him to trial, techniques of deliberate, sustained cruelty that lasted hours. He did not delegate this work. He was present. He was, so by multiple accounts, enthusiastic. On April 6, 1944, a date burned into French memory, Barbie ordered the raid on a Jewish children's home in the village of Izieu, 40 miles east of Lyon. 44 Jewish children, aged 3 to 13, were arrested, along with 7 adult staff members. They were loaded onto trucks. Barbie personally sent the telex to Paris confirming the arrest. All 44 children were deported to Auschwitz. None survived. At the end of the war, Barbie fled to Germany. And here is where the story turns from atrocity to institutional betrayal of a different kind. In 1947, Barbie was recruited by the United States Army Counterintelligence Corps, the CIC, as an informant and operative. His handlers knew who he was. They knew his history, at least partially. They chose to use him anyway, and his value was his knowledge of communist networks in occupied Germany, and in the early logic of what was becoming the Cold War, that knowledge was considered worth the price. The CIC protected Barbie from French war crimes investigators who were actively searching for him. On at least 2 occasions, American handlers physically moved him and his family to avoid detection. When his usefulness was exhausted and his presence became a diplomatic liability, the CIC did not hand him over to justice. They arranged his escape through the rat line. In 1951, Klaus Barbie, his wife, and his 2 children sailed from Genoa under the assumed name Klaus Altmann. They disembarked in Buenos Aires and then made their way to Bolivia. Klaus Barbie lived in Bolivia for 32 years. He worked as a businessman. He worked, at various points, as an advisor to the Bolivian security services, teaching interrogation techniques to a new generation of torturers in a new country. He had neighbors. He had friends. He was not hiding in the jungle. He was living openly in La Paz. He was not found by governments. He was found in 1971 by a Nazi hunter, a German journalist named Beta Klarsfeld, who had made it her life's work to track escaped perpetrators. She identified him. She made it public. And for 11 more years, Bolivia refused to extradite him. He was finally deported to France in 1983, 39 years after the raid on Izieu. He stood trial in Lyon in 1987, was convicted of crimes against humanity, and died in prison in 1991. For 44 murdered children, the wait for justice was 47 years. And Barbie was one of the rare ones who was actually found. The man who organized the entire machinery of deportation, who sat at the center of the logistical web that moved millions of human beings to their deaths, almost never faced justice at all. Adolf Eichmann's escape and eventual capture is the most documented case in the entire history of Nazi fugitives, and it remains, even now, almost impossible to fully absorb. Eichmann was not a camp guard. He was not a trigger man. He was a manager. He headed the Jewish Affairs section of the Reich Main Security Office, the RSHA, and his specific function was coordination, making sure that the deportation trains ran, that the receiving camps had capacity, that the paperwork flowed correctly between 15 different national bureaucracies across occupied Europe. He was, in Hannah Arendt's later formulation, the bureaucrat of genocide, and the man who proved that mass murder could be administered like a railway timetable. After Germany's defeat, Eichmann was captured by American forces, but escaped from a POW camp before his true identity was established. He spent several years living under an assumed name inside Germany, working as a lumberjack, of all things, in the forests of northern Bavaria. Then, in 1950, he made his move, through the rat line, with a Red Cross travel document issued in the name Ricardo Clement. He passed through Austria, through the Brenner Pass, through Rome, where he received assistance from a Franciscan friar named Eduardo de Motter, who was connected to the same network Hudal had helped establish, and boarded a ship in Genoa bound for Argentina. He arrived in Buenos Aires in July 1950, so he eventually settled in a modest house in a suburb called San Fernando, on the outskirts of the city. He worked in a Mercedes-Benz factory. His family joined him. He was not entirely anonymous. He was known to certain circles of former Nazis in Argentina, and he occasionally spoke, among them, with dangerous candor about his wartime role. But to the Argentine government of Juan Perón, which had welcomed thousands of European war criminals, with a bureaucratic openness that still demands full historical accounting, he was simply another German immigrant. The Israeli intelligence service Mossad located him in 1960. The operation to capture him, carried out on May 11, 1960, on a street in San Fernando as Eichmann returned home from work, involved a team of Mossad operatives who had been surveilling him for months to confirm his identity beyond doubt. They seized him. They held him in a safe house in Buenos Aires for 9 days. They sedated him, disguised him as an El Al crew member, and flew him to Israel on a commercial flight. He was tried in Jerusalem in 1961 in a proceeding that was broadcast internationally and watched by millions. He was convicted of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against the Jewish people. He was hanged on May 31, 1962. His body was cremated and his ashes scattered at sea outside Israeli territorial waters because there was no country whose soil deserved to hold them. The capture of Eichmann was the single greatest achievement of post-war Nazi hunting, and it happened 15 years after the end of the war. 15 years in which this man administered the genocide of a continent and then lived quietly in Argentina while the survivors of his system tried to rebuild their lives. There is a pattern in all of these cases that must be named directly. The Cold War did not merely delay justice. In many documented instances, it actively subverted it. American, British, and West German intelligence services recruited former SS officers, former Gestapo operatives, and former Nazi scientists with a consistency and scale that went far beyond individual cases of poor judgment. Operation Paperclip is the most famous example in the American context. Beginning in 1945, the United States military and intelligence apparatus systematically recruited German scientists, including men with direct personal involvement in the use of concentration camp slave labor for weapons research, and brought them to the United States. Wernher von Braun, who became the architect of the American space program and a celebrated national figure, had been a member of the SS and had personally toured the Mittelwerk underground factory, where V-2 rockets were built by concentration camp prisoners under conditions of deliberate murderous brutality. American officials knew this. They classified the information. They proceeded. In West Germany itself, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND, West Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service was built in large part on the organizational skeleton of a wartime Nazi intelligence network run by General Reinhard Gehlen. The Gehlen Organization, as it was known, was handed to the Americans in 1946 as a ready-made anti-Soviet intelligence apparatus, and it employed, throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, dozens of men with war crimes histories. The United States funded it. The West German government, when it was established, absorbed it. And the West German legal system itself, the institution most directly responsible for prosecuting Nazi war crimes on German soil, was staffed throughout the 1950s by judges, prosecutors, and Justice Ministry officials who had served the Nazi state. The German legal profession had participated actively in the legal machinery of the Third Reich. After 1945, most of those men kept their jobs, changed their ideological tone, and spent the 1950s systematically blocking, delaying, and undermining prosecutions. A study published decades later found that of the roughly 100,000 individuals estimated to have participated directly in the Holocaust, fewer than 7,000 were ever convicted of anything in a German court. Fewer than 7,000. The Frankfurt-Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965 were supposed to change this. They were the first time a German court had put former Auschwitz personnel on trial in a proceeding organized by German prosecutors operating under German law. 22 defendants stood in the dock. The lead prosecutor, Fritz Bauer, himself a Jewish German who had survived the Nazi period in exile in Denmark and Sweden, had fought for years against institutional obstruction to bring this case to trial. He received death threats. He was wiretapped, reportedly by West German intelligence. He was isolated within his own professional world. The trial produced convictions. It produced testimony, public, detailed, forensic testimony from survivors, that forced German society to confront what had actually happened inside the camps in a way that the Nuremberg trials, conducted by occupying foreign powers, had never quite achieved domestically. Hannah Arendt covered the Eichmann trial. A generation of German journalists covered Frankfurt. The evidence was now public and undeniable. And yet of the 22 defendants, 6 received life sentences, and the remaining 16 received sentences ranging from 3 to 14 years. Many served less than their full terms. The men who had run the crematoria, administered the selections, supervised the gas chambers. They received sentences a German court might give a serious property criminal. Fritz Bauer died in 1968, alone in his apartment, under circumstances that were officially ruled accidental, but that his colleagues always regarded with suspicion. He had spent the last decade of his life fighting a system that did not want the cases he was bringing. He never saw the broader reckoning he had worked toward. History gave him a footnote. He deserved a monument. The climax of this story does not happen in a courtroom or on a battlefield. It happens on a Wednesday morning in July 1979, in the city of Asunción, Paraguay. Josef Mengele. The name alone carries a particular weight of horror. Mengele was the SS physician stationed at Auschwitz-Birkenau, who stood on the selection ramp and decided, with a gesture of his hand, who lived and who went immediately to the gas chambers. He also ran a program of medical experiments on prisoners, particularly twins, whom he used as research subjects in procedures that had no legitimate scientific purpose and that caused suffering that survivors described in terms beyond ordinary language. He was not a peripheral figure. He was not following orders reluctantly. Every account agrees. He was enthusiastic. He was present voluntarily for procedures he was not required to attend. He had a name among the prisoners, the Angel of Death. At the end of the war, the Mengele was captured by American forces, then released. His name was not yet on the major war crimes lists. The documentation connecting him to his crimes would take time to compile. He returned to his family's farm equipment business in Bavaria. Then, When investigators began closing in, he fled. Through the rat line, to Argentina in 1949. Then to Paraguay in 1959, when Argentina became less safe after the Eichmann operation. Then to Brazil. He lived in Brazil, in the interior of São Paulo state, for the last decades of his life. He was protected, at various points, by a circle of German Brazilian families who knew exactly who he was. The West German government, which had issued an international arrest warrant for him, received multiple tips about his location over the years. None led to serious coordinated action. The Mossad, which had captured Eichmann, considered operations against Mengele and ultimately declined to pursue them with the same resources. On February 7, 1979, Josef Mengele went swimming at a beach near the town of Bertioga on the Brazilian coast. He suffered a stroke in the water and drowned. He was 67 years old. He was buried under a false name. His death was not confirmed until 1992, when DNA testing of exhumed remains finally established his identity. He had lived for 34 years after the end of the war. He had never stood trial. He had never been convicted of anything. He had never, not once, been forced to look a single survivor in the eye and account for what he had done. The last image of Josef Mengele on this earth is a man dying in warm water, in the Brazilian sun, far from any courtroom, far from any justice, far from the children whose suffering he had caused and felt nothing about. That is not a metaphor. That is history. And history does not forgive what it allowed. What remains? What are the numbers that must be faced? Historians estimate that between 50,000 and 100,000 individuals bore criminal responsibility for the Holocaust as direct perpetrators, administrators, or supervisors of mass murder. Of these, fewer than 10% were ever tried. Of those tried, a fraction received sentences commensurate with their crimes. Most perpetrators served no time at all. Argentina alone accepted between 5,000 and 10,000 Nazi war criminals and collaborators in the decade after 1945, with the active facilitation of Juan Perón's government, from which saw European fascists as ideologically useful and economically productive immigrants. Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, Paraguay, Syria, Egypt, and Spain all received significant numbers. Some found sanctuary in countries that had themselves been Nazi collaborators and preferred no scrutiny of their own wartime records. The rat lines themselves were formally dismantled as operational infrastructure by the early 1960s. But their legacy was not dismantled. It was institutionalized. The same networks of church contacts, intelligence relationships, and political protection that had moved SS men to South America had normalized a certain way of thinking about accountability, that it was optional, conditional, and ultimately subordinate to other priorities. Simon Wiesenthal spent 50 years in a small office in Vienna, on building case files on escaped perpetrators with almost no institutional support. He died in 2005 at age 96, having contributed to the identification and prosecution of more than 1,100 Nazi war criminals. Beate and Serge Klarsfeld continued their work for decades, forcing German courts and French public opinion to confront cases the official systems had buried. The last survivor of the Nuremberg trials prosecution team died in 2019. The injustice was never repaired. The scale of what went unpunished is not a historical anomaly. It is a structural fact about how states prioritize accountability when accountability becomes inconvenient. That pattern, that logic, is not confined to 1945. It operates in every era where power decides that justice is a luxury it cannot afford. Why does this history still burn? Because what the rat lines represent is not merely a failure of post-war law enforcement. They represent a choice. Every false document signed by a church official was a choice. Every CIC handler who moved Klaus Barbie away from French investigators made a choice. Every West German judge who buried a prosecution file made a choice. Every South American government that stamped a passport without asking questions made a choice. And what all those choices shared, what they whispered to each other across institutions, borders, and decades, was this: these men's futures matter more than their victims' justice. That is not a 1945 problem. That is a human problem. It is the logic of every cover-up, every institutional protection of the powerful, every moment when a system looks at an atrocity and decides that the cost of accountability is too high. The rat lines were built not by monsters acting alone, but by ordinary institutional actors. Bureaucrats, clerics, intelligence officers, judges, who made incremental choices that collectively amounted to the betrayal of the dead. The lesson is not that evil is unstoppable. The lesson is that evil requires maintenance. It requires the active participation of people who tell themselves they are neutral, practical, or simply doing their jobs. The victims of the Holocaust deserved justice. They did not receive it. Knowing that, sitting with that, refusing to let it be smoothed over, is the beginning of any serious moral seriousness about the past. Do not look away. That is all history asks. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. It matters that you did. Subscribe to The Unseen Past. Stories like this one are only possible because you keep watching. There is another story coming that will make this one feel like a prelude.